I'm Thierry Heles. This is The Next Leap. War in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, daily cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. As geopolitical tensions spike, capital is flooding into defense, and even a growing number of universities are open to research in this space. Yet money invested in security innovation is money not spent on global aid. So should we really be doing this? Hetti Barkworth-Nanton says yes. As the CEO of Ploughshare Innovations, the commercialisation arm of the UK's Ministry of Defence, she's positioned at the heart of this debate. But her other role, chair of Refuge, which is a charity supporting domestic abuse survivors, throws a spanner into easy answers. How could a grenade ever be good for children? Well, Hetti does have a concrete, surprising example here. On this episode, we explore the uncomfortable tensions and unexpected synergies between securing nations and protecting the vulnerable. Hetti unpacks the philosophy behind commercialising defence innovation, why universities should engage with this space, and what it really means to balance competing goods in an uncertain world. Hetti, welcome.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
I look forward to this conversation. As we're recording this, the news is also, I think, very timely for a conversation about defence.
Yep.
So maybe let's start with an easy one, though. Can you give me an overview of the kind of work that Ploughshare does?
Yes, of course. So we are an organisation that is not in government, but we are 100% owned by the Ministry of Defence here in the UK. We've been in existence for 20 years. And very simply what we do, although we'll talk further in terms of how we've expanded, but at a fundamental level, we take intellectual property that's been developed for defence research in the Ministry of Defence and we spin it out into ventures, so either into existing companies or into new spin-out companies to deliver capability both into defence where it's relevant, but also critically into other civilian markets. And we're ultimately here to deliver impact. We're very focused on impact, not short-term financial returns, so delivering against the growth agenda and the growth of UK PLC, as well as creating jobs, as well as saving lives, as well as contributing towards the environmental challenges of the world. So that's us.
Awesome. As you said, quite a few things in there that we'll talk about in more detail. Maybe start with more of the civilian aspect. A lot of technologies that we have these days, commonplace, originated in defence, the internet. That hasn't really been the case in more recent years. Has that presented any kind of challenges that this technology hasn't come out of defence into the civilian world?
Not so much challenges, but I think massive missed opportunity. So if we unpack that a little bit, as you rightly point out, whether it's the internet, whether it's the microwave, whether it's antibiotics, whether it is even mobile technology, it all came historically out of defence. And that was true through pretty much the first half of the 20th century. Why? Because a lot of money was being spent on defence, obviously because you had the First and the Second World Wars. And therefore, that's where the focus of kind of very strong and very groundbreaking innovation was across the world. As we went into the Cold War, that defence investment went down considerably. And at the same time, you saw the bubble that was created by the internet, ironically, but also, the telco industry starting to really explode. So a lot of the innovation that we would know and understand today was actually being done outside of defence for pretty much 50 years. Yes, there was still innovation being done in defence. Yes, we've got examples of where we've taken it out, but fundamentally the big swing was back into non-defence markets. That is changing now. Obviously, there is a big sort of flip now to a lot of investment going into defence innovation. Some of that is taking civilian innovation and bringing it back into defence and adapting it for defence, which is great. But there is a lot, there's billions of pounds in the UK only going into defence research. And we need to make sure, and we make it our mission to ensure that more and more of that comes out, because in the UK, but also across the world, and we only have to look at the last 2 weeks and the impact of the Iranian war, the economic impact of war is massive. And we need to ensure that we are doing everything we can to take that innovation, that really cool, groundbreaking innovation in defence, and make sure that it's delivering against the growth agenda, not just in the UK, but across the world.
Yeah, we'll come back to this as well, but I think it's quite interesting to hear you talk in this Because I think when people think about defense spending, it's a lot of the like, oh, warmongering kind of, we'll build bombs, we'll blow stuff up, which in the case of the Iranian war, maybe is exactly what has happened.
Yeah.
But it is more about the protecting, and it is about the wider knock-on impacts. It's a huge interconnected system of things that get impacted. Have you seen any impact from an increase in government spending in the UK in this already, or do you expect to see any significant impact?
Absolutely. We're seeing increased allocations of money to defence in the UK and again across the world. A commitment by UK Prime Minister to increase defence spend to 2035 to 5% of GDP. We've historically, certainly for the last 10, 15, 20 years, been at sort of 2.5%. So it's a massive, massive jump. Of course, it takes time to filter its way through the system. But again, to make it real on a global stage, in the UK, we have made decisions to reduce the amount of money that we're putting into international development and realign it to defence. Okay, so it has very, very real effects on people's lives, and we have to recognise that. And that means that, again, we have, I think, a social duty to ensure that that money is well spent and is ultimately delivering back into society and delivering economic growth, which ultimately benefits societies around the world.
That would have been a follow-on question from that. What would you say to people that say we should be spending more on international aid and not spend it on weapons? It is the weapons that's sort of in the back of people's minds when they hear these things.
This is a huge, massive philosophical debate, but all of these things are interconnected, and that's the problem. My other job in the UK is I'm the chair of the board for a charity called Refuge, which is the largest single frontline service provider of services to women and children affected by domestic abuse. So I'm very much involved in that world. I'm very concerned about the impact on men and boys in terms of the growth in misogyny, the growth in the far right. All of these things are interconnected, and we need to see them as interconnected and do our very best across the piece to ensure that we are getting the balance right. But let me give you an example of how all these things connect. So we do know that, in part, the actions of foreign actors, particularly online, and the use of algorithms is in part resulting in the kind of division in society that we're seeing in the Western world. That is really the front line of war, and you can define war however you like, but at the end of the day, we have been for many years in this weird space where it doesn't feel like war as we understand it, but actually there is a lot of war going on in the online world that we don't see. That's creating division. That's creating real impact on people's lives in society. And all of this then gets connected with the economic impact of war and the requirement to invest in war. So they're all connected. And I would just urge listeners just to open your mind to how all these pieces join up, what we can all do and what you can do individually to do your bit to help society, to help victims, and to help ensure that we are doing everything we can to, yes, we have to spend money in defence because ultimately that does protect lives, and we can talk a bit about that. But also we need to make sure that we are understanding the impact it's having on lives and really support those lives that are affected.
Yeah.
No, this is going to become this sort of political debate, but let's have it anyway.
I think it is important to have these views from someone who is working in this area, because it's not a narrative that is maybe told by the news. It's not a nuanced debate, and that goes back to the divisive society, and it goes back to that doesn't get clicks if you have a nuanced debate about these things. Maybe it should, but there we go. I'm going to pick on a few things that you said there, though. The wars being fought online and having nation states, partly with social media, partly nation states attacking infrastructure. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that Ploughshare and the MOD are doing in this field?
Yes, so I can't really talk to the specific work that the MOD are doing in this field in terms of defence, just because largely I'm not close enough to it, and I shouldn't and I couldn't put myself forward as being a spokesperson in that regard. But, rest assured, you've got the likes of GCHQ in national security, you've got other work being done within the MOD, the Ministry of Defence. There is a lot of money and a lot of hard work that goes into looking at that real threat in terms of cyber, that real threat in terms of online, and what is being done day in, day out to counteract that. Don't underestimate the amount of effort that's going into that, of course. In terms of what that means for Ploughshare, we get an increasing amount of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and developments coming our way. I would say that's probably gone from being maybe 10% of our portfolio 10 years ago to being the best part of 50% of our portfolio. So it's gone up significantly, and quite right too. It brings challenges because we know two things, right? When you are commercializing engineering technology, it's a relatively straightforward and well-trodden pathway to do that. Yes, it needs a lot of capital, which brings with it different challenges, but at the end of the day, you kind of know what thing you're dealing with. When you're dealing with software and artificial intelligence, it's much more complex, and I'm sure people who are listening will understand this. Going to market, it's very hard to patent these things. So in terms of protection, which is really important if you're going to have a business that is investable, that's a challenge, which means that actually it's time to market and talent that wins the day when you're looking at those kind of things. And that's a challenge, coupled with the fact that quite a lot of the stuff that we are dealing with has been developed for a use case and has never been developed to the point whereby it's a sustainable capability. So it needs quite a lot of work doing to it. You have to kind of do a lot more thinking. It's easy to take a box that's been developed and say, I know what that box is for, and you can take it forward and you can take it up the IRL stages, and it's quite easy. But when you've got an algorithm, it's quite difficult to kind of figure out what on earth that could be used for, and also how you get to that market. So it just brings a different mindset. So we've done a lot of work in bringing in new digital skills. We have got a lot more people on the outside world who are AI experts who are helping us and advising us, because I cannot pretend that we've got all the skills internally within Ploughshare. So it is requiring a different model, a much more outside-in attitude and approach to the work that we do. But that's exciting, right? Because everyone loves to learn new things and understand how to do things differently. And the pace is exciting, because I think in our world, sometimes it just feels like it takes an inordinate amount of time to get something up the TRLs and to get it out there and then get the business scaling. It's a bit more exciting with AI because actually you just got to get on with it.
Yeah. AI in general, the technology is moving and developing so fast that you also can't wait because you'll be left behind.
Exactly.
I want to take a look at money as well. There's a lot of VCs that have started looking at defense tech. There's the big headline, CEO of Spotify, Daniel Ek, put 600 million into Helsing, which makes me wonder, is that an issue? Because what does the CEO of Spotify know about defense? Or is that still a good thing, because ultimately these companies still also need a lot of cash, and whether it's dumb cash or money with expertise is still ultimately a good thing? How do you see that?
Look, I'm very positive about any funding that comes into defence. We work closely with Helsing. Helsing know their space and they know what's needed. And so they are very adept at taking capital and turning it into value for defence. So I got no issue with that. Question mark whether the founder of Spotify gets a bit involved in defence. That might be an interesting conversation. But, if it's capital, crack on, okay? And, Helsing have had the vast majority of capital funding in the UK. I think 70% of capital across Europe goes into Helsing at the moment, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But does put a sort of slight responsibility on Helsing, I think.
Yeah.
In terms of ensuring that they are not only obviously delivering brilliant capability into the defence sector, but also working with SMEs, working with founders, and really being a catalyst for success for others in what they're doing. And that's certainly the type of conversation that I have with them, is, they are really interested in helping and being that force multiplier for startups within the UK, particularly within their space. And I think that can only be a good thing.
That's interesting, because I think one of the questions from that is, if one company gets such a huge percentage of all the money, is that then just a case of the VCs streaming in because they want their golden goose? And they've sort of identified Helsing as the one, but there could be other smaller companies that maybe lose out that have tech that is just as worthwhile. So it's interesting to hear that Helsing is aware of this and trying to build the ecosystem around themselves.
They definitely are. I also think, look, there's a lot more interest in defence. I'm sure we'll talk about it, but there is, that whole question of offensive versus defensive capability. And there's a lot of people who want to be in defence, but they don't want to be doing offensive stuff. But number one, there isn't enough. Number two, the defence sector is still very hard to penetrate as a startup. And the work, certainly in the UK, the Ministry of Defence, doing a fundamental rewiring, really, of how the Ministry of Defence works, and particularly focused on innovation and how you create an engine for innovation that really enables startups to be successful. Because historically, the Ministry of Defence has been probably one of the worst customers you can get, right? Their procurement cycle times are just eye-wateringly ghastly, and most startups would be out of business months before anything comes through by way of an order. They know they're onto that, they are looking to address it, and they're starting to have some green shoots in that respect. So I think that's brilliant. But we do need a really thriving defence industry, and defence procurement and defence worldwide needs to be much more joined up, in my view. Because if you're a defence startup and you're in the UK market is interesting, but it's never going to give you, particularly if it's deep tech and you need a lot of capital, it's never going to give you the amount of market, the amount of purchase orders, for want of a better word, that's going to justify the amount of investment that you're going to need. So we need to be joined up across the world, whether it's Five Eyes, whether it's NATO, across the Western world, and certainly doing what we can to ensure that an order from the UK isn't just an order from the UK, but it's an order from the whole of NATO.
A lot of interesting things in there that I'm going to pick you up on. Maybe staying on your last point, expanding internationally, there are obviously export controls in place in the UK, and most nations have those, which then limits which markets that defence tech spinouts could go into, and NATO and AUKUS and Five Eyes are maybe obvious places. How do you help spinouts navigate this space? How do you show them where they could go with the technology that they have?
So two ways. One, obviously, we're getting the nascent intellectual property from the Ministry of Defence. So we're working with Ministry of Defence intellectual property attorneys in the first instance to ensure that their patents are appropriate in terms of where in the world they can operate. If you don't do that right, then it's game over anyway. But we have got a lot of expertise, and we work with others within the Ministry of Defence and the Department for Business and Trade to ensure that export controls isn't an issue, which doesn't mean that we're circumventing export controls, just to be clear, but that we are doing it properly. Export controls is not about fundamentally stopping industry from trading internationally. It's about doing it safely. And that's where we put quite a lot of our effort. And where, interestingly enough, we get quite a lot of universities in the UK coming to talk to us, because export controls is something they really don't understand. And why would they? Both in terms of understanding how to support their spin-outs with regards to export controls, but also taking what I call defence-inspired research that has been done in universities that might have a security classification, and the teams within the tech transfer offices are not security cleared, so often they can't even look at it, and if they can look at it, they're not expert in understanding how to unpick the classification to the point whereby they can spin it out. Because quite often, let's take something that is classified, even secret, and we've got examples of this. Actually, when you dig underneath it, the thing that is driving the secret classification is not the innovation itself, it's the way in which it's being used.
Okay.
And that's actually where we as Ploughshare, as an independent company, can be really valuable, because we can work with patent attorneys and with the inventors to really get to the root of where's the invention here and what is it, and does it need to be security classified? And therefore, 9 times out of 10, we can get it unclassified or classified to the point whereby we can do something with it. And we don't have to share where that innovation has come from. We don't have to share the purpose for which that innovation was done in the first place. If that innovation was actually being commercialised by the Ministry of Defence or by national security, it would be much harder for them to avoid that conversation about where's it come from and what was the use.
Interesting. The glitter industry says we have a massive client and we can't tell anyone who it is. And everyone online thinks that it's some kind of defense or military use, which I think makes sense, because if it's a secret, then it's probably one of those. But glitter is not a secret technology. Like, you can go into the corner shop and buy yourself a bag of glitter. You can get it. It's fine. But then, yeah, the application of it is the secret, is the classified part.
Piece, exactly.
Do you find that universities are becoming more open to defense tech, or is there still resistance from them?
I think it's really shifting, Thierry. So I've been speaking to the universities. I joined Ploughshare as CEO 6 years ago. And then, my early conversations with universities was sort of, not entirely, but sort of Okay, you crack on and do your thing because we don't touch that. And that's not across the board. We've got some very, very strong universities in the UK that have worked in defence for a long time, and that's brilliant. But as a general thing, what we found was, and what is changing, is that universities would take on board research. Some of them definitely wouldn't, but many of them would, but they would not spin it out for two reasons. One, because of the lack of specific expertise within the tech transfer offices, which we've already talked about, but also because socially, academics within universities are typically not, supporters of war. And that comes back to our conversation around offensive versus defensive. There is a perception that anything that the Ministry of Defence does, or any other part of defence across the world, there is this real kind of long-held belief that it's all a bad thing. And that has then, over a long period of time within universities in particular, created this culture where there really has not been much being spun out into the defence space from universities in the UK. That is definitely changing. So we have got a lot more universities now leaning into defence and looking at how they can bring defence into their courses. So there's a lot more on that, because there's a recognition that if we are going to be on a war footing, we need to make sure that we have got people coming through universities with the right kind of education. So that's definitely a movement that we're seeing. But we're also seeing a lot more universities now saying, actually, we've got some really interesting innovation and we want to talk about it. So it is absolutely shifting, and it needs to shift, let's be honest.
I'm assuming what universities are doing is more on the defensive than the offensive side, or are they open to both?
Look, there'll be one or two universities that will be open to both. But no, absolutely. No, most of them, and most investors, actually, this is true of investors as well, will have a sort of thesis, for want of a better word, written down either explicitly or implicitly, that basically says they don't want to get involved in things that kill people, whichever words they use for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then it probably doesn't help that in places like the US, they renamed it to the Department of War, which, I mean, it's a very populist move, which is sort of befitting of the current administration over there.
It is, but I'll give you another view on that, Thierry. And we talked right at the beginning about society, okay? And this division in society that we're increasingly seeing, that I see firsthand in the work that I do in violence against women and girls. At some point, I think we probably need to name it more than we are. What you call the department is frankly irrelevant. But we have had our Prime Minister in the UK saying that the UK is now on a war footing. And there is something about the use of the word war from a mentality point of view in society that can create shifts that otherwise are impossible to take. So, yeah, naming of the department is frankly, in my book, irrelevant, right? But being prepared to talk about war, being prepared to talk about the fact that we are on a war footing, and we don't know what that means yet, but it does mean that we cannot put our heads in the sand and hope that it all goes away. This is going to require a whole society approach, and I think that's going to be the challenge over the next 5-10 years.
I think it's an interesting place that you sit at, because, I mean, I am a civilian. Other than wanting to live, I don't have skin in the game, quote unquote. And I can see, we've had war in Europe for years now. I mean, war is basically on our doorstep with Ukraine. Cyprus being attacked.
And let's unpack that theory. We've got war in Europe. It's not just Russia and Ukraine. You've got North Korean troops in Europe, fighting in Europe. We've got Iranian influence, certainly, probably actually being on the ground in Europe, in Ukraine. This isn't far away, and this isn't just a battle between Russia and Ukraine for a bit of land. It's much more fundamental than that. Anyway, should we talk about some jolly stuff?
Yes. I was going to ask you more about your work with Refuge. I don't know if that's jolly, but I think it's more about making the world a better place. So maybe we can count that as jolly.
Yep.
You talked about this a little bit, but how do you square that circle? On one side, work for Ploughshare, on the other side, work with Refuge. Does that create conflict, maybe more on the Refuge side? Like, are the people there okay with having someone from technically the MOD in charge of protecting women?
It seems fine now. We'll talk a little bit about that, but it hasn't been fine. So at the beginning, when I literally got the job at Ploughshare and at Refuge pretty much right at the same time,
Wow.
like within weeks of each other. I was offered the Refuge job, and then a week later I was offered the Ploughshare job. And once the Refuge leadership got wind of my role at Ploughshare, they already didn't want me because I was going to bring change, right? I'm a change agent. And that was something that was being resisted heavily. But when I got the Ploughshare one, that was rich pickings for them, such that there was an article in the Saturday Telegraph with the headline, "Arms Dealing Anti-Feminist Takes Over at Refuge."
That's a very Telegraph headline if ever I've heard one.
Very Telegraph headline. I had sort of people who were very high profile in the UK. I'll say no more, but I had very high profile people in the UK challenging me on what the hell I'm doing. Okay. Now, I hadn't taken the job, and this comes right into the heart of the offensive versus defensive debate, right? I hadn't taken the job even thinking that it would be an issue, because I didn't see that I was joining a job at Ploughshare that was about creating bombs and going and killing people. It just wasn't the kind of way in which it had been positioned to me, etc., etc. So I needed to kind of dig deep, but I also needed to understand what the heck was going on. And I think there's two things. One is actually we need much more join up between the violence against women and girls movement and defence. Why? Because a lot of the work that the military do overseas, and they would tell you this, but a lot of the work the military do overseas, particularly when they've got boots on the ground, are actually largely about protecting women and girls. And you only have to look at Afghanistan and what's happened in Afghanistan since the US and the UK and other Western militaries pulled out. The situation in Afghanistan is absolutely horrific. Women and girls have no rights, cannot go to school, cannot work, and they are just absolutely the lowest of the low. That has happened since the Western world pulled out militarily. So that's important to understand. The second thing to understand is that actually there's a lot of innovation that we have at Ploughshare and that comes out of defence that is really important in terms of protecting women and girls. For instance, one of our licenses is a piece of technology that was developed again in the labs across a university and the Ministry of Defence that can identify fingerprints on materials when ordinary fingerprint technology cannot detect them, particularly on knives and particularly on things that have been underwater.
Huh.
That gives us the ability to be able to detect fingerprints and to identify ultimately the perpetrators of crime where previously we haven't been able to. And it has solved cold cases. And pretty much every one of those cold cases that it's solved has been where a woman has been murdered.
Wow. It's giving me chills, to be honest with you.
So that brings it right home to you. And there's other technologies that we have, which is harder to talk about, that's about, looking at surveillance and ensuring that you can better protect women and girls. This stuff is rich pickings for us. And actually, because I've got the role at Refuge and Ploughshare, I'm able to join those dots in a way in which others aren't.
Yeah.
And technology is a massive, massive issue when it comes to violence against women and girls. The use of technology to monitor victims, to coerce them, to control them, to undermine their freedom of life, and to make them feel utterly worthless, whether that's your innocent Ring doorbell or whether it's something more sinister. That is stuff that we are looking at all the time in terms of technologies coming out of Ploughshare and how it can help to address some of those issues. So we're on it, right? Actually, violence against women and girls is benefiting from the fact that I'm working at that intersection between defence and civilian.
It almost sounds like this should have been by design. I know it was sort of coincidence, or maybe it was fate, if people believe in that. And again, I think that's a really good example of something that was developed maybe with a defense view filtering through into the civilian world, quote unquote, into forensics, which is part of the civilian world, solving cold cases and finding quick. Because fingerprints of things that have been underwater, I would have assumed that they get washed out enough to not be detectable.
At the end of the day, I really strongly believe that I am measured by what I do and the impact that I have. And that's been nothing but positive in the violence against women and girls sector. I'll give you another interesting example, actually, which was one that was pulled out in those early days with Refuge when they were looking for, things to prove that I'm all about bombs, really, aren't I? And we had a piece of technology that was effectively a grenade. Okay, so on face value, it's like, whoa. I have to admit, when I looked at it and it was pointed out to me, I was like, ooh. But actually, it's not a grenade. It's something you fit into a grenade. But what it is a piece of technology that means when you are trying to rescue hostages, you have to ultimately blow the door in, right? But the problem with blowing the door in is that the risk of killing or severely injuring people the other side of the door, including your hostages, is high. What this technology does is it enables you to blow the door in without blowing the door in. In other words, I don't know how it works because I'm not a techie, but effectively it means that you can remove the door with a blast that does not blast back into the room, and therefore you do not get the horrible word, but collateral damage that you do in a normal situation. That is about defense. That's about saving lives. That's about ensuring that you can rescue people in a hostage situation, which is very typical in war and often includes women and girls, and ensures that you can do it in a safe way. I think it's a great example of where on face value it looks like it's offensive. It looks ghastly, right? It's a grenade.
It's blowing something up, yeah.
Blowing something up, but actually it's blowing something up that you need to blow up, and it's doing it safely.
It's horrific that we need things like that, but I'm really glad that things like that are being developed, and I think it's a really good example. Again, on very different sides of the spectrum, from the finding fingerprints to the blowing something up, and both are about saving people's lives. One of them maybe fits more, as you said, into the view that people have that it is about bombs and grenades, which in this case it sort of is, I suppose, part of a grenade. You said you're a change agent. You worked in industry before you came to Ploughshare. I think it was Vodafone, Openreach, Centrica, British Airways. What attracted you to Ploughshare? What was the selling point?
No small part of the selling point was not being in a big corporate, if I'm really honest. And my appreciation to everybody who continues to work in big corporates. They do lots of great stuff and they are an engine for the economy. So fantastic. But I kind of paid my penance, right? When you're doing the sort of work that I'd been doing in all of those organizations where, it was big leadership roles, but always anchored in driving massive transformational change, what you're doing is you are doing the difficult stuff. You are cutting across the departments, the silos in the organization. One of the problems that large corporates have is silos, driven by all sorts of things. It's not for today. We can discuss it another time. But my job was always to cut across those, and that's difficult. You're cutting across departments, you're cutting across processes, but usually, honestly, you're cutting across egos, because ultimately the people that are running those silos are usually quite high on the ego side of things. So it's a difficult place to be, and I was tired of that. I knew there was so much more in me. I had been through extreme trauma, I had been through cancer, so I was sort of physically and mentally tired as well. And I just wanted to have a bit of fun. It sounds strange. And then I came across Ploughshare. I was contacted about Ploughshare because I didn't even know this world existed. And if anyone's listening, I suppose no one's going to be listening to this that doesn't know the world exists, so it's a bit of a moot point. What we do in terms of commercialization is the world's best kept secret. It literally is. I had never heard of it before I came to Ploughshare. And it's brilliant. It's brilliant stuff, right? It is fueling. It is the engine to the growth of economies across the world, and yet no one knows about it. When I started speaking to Ploughshare, I thought, okay, so I get to run my own gig, I get to be CEO, which is kind of fun, and I really want to create a culture that I'm proud of, because culture is a big, important thing for me and a big driver. They need to be diverse, they need to be inclusive, and never more so when you're doing innovation. So that's great, that's a tick. It sounds really cool, and the thought of doing different things all the time. You could be doing a medical spin out one day and you could be doing a grenade spin out the next day, right? I mean, the diversity is massive, which is really fun. Getting involved in and understanding the startup world and investment world, etc., etc. I thought, well, that's quite cool. That's quite fun. But I also knew I could do it because I knew that the only way in which a small business like Ploughshare could be successful is in its way in which it interacts through those silos back into the big Ministry of Defence, or back into the wider ecosystem. Ultimately, it's about connecting, and connecting is probably my superpower. So I think it's a long-winded answer to your question, Thierry, but it's never disappointed. There's been times when it's been really hard, and probably most notably because of the difficulties of navigating the very different culture in the Ministry of Defence, right, which is historically certainly less so now, but has historically been risk averse, heavy on process, very, 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 very slow. And we are a kind of ambidextrous part of that, or as ambidextrous arm that sits on the edge, that is fast, fun, innovative, creative, far reaching, takes more risk, all of those. That's probably been the biggest challenge over the last 2 or 3 years, but we're getting there. It's starting to come together.
It was a very interesting answer, actually, but I think it makes sense stitching these different parts together that maybe weren't talking to each other.
And I think the other thing that, to be honest, from a personal point of view, is that, and again, this may or may not resonate with people, I'd probably spent, I was very senior very quickly at British Airways. And I've been doing transformation in various guises. So BA, I put the very first seatback video onto the aircraft back in the 1990s. I did the very first early work around the internet. I did the business case for the London Eye. So really interesting, cool stuff, which is not for today. But as I then went to the other organisations, and I was really largely bringing my expertise and capability and skills and leadership into different environments. But I wasn't learning anything new because I was still in a corporate world. I knew how to do governance. I knew how to do programs. I knew how to create a vision. I knew how to engage with people. It was the same, but different stuff.
Mm.
And what I absolutely love about Ploughshare is that I'm learning every day. I'm literally learning every day. And it's given me a new lease of life that I never thought I would get.
Oh, that's great. I get that. You made yourself the expert and then it was just giving the expertise just in different places, but without getting anything back for it. Whereas this is a massive challenge and a really interesting time that we live in. When you talk about silos, there is also the Government Office of Technology Transfer, which has also kind of been set up to remove these silos between different government departments. Do you work with GOT, or is that entirely separate from the work at Ploughshare?
I'd say we work adjacent to GOT. They tend not to touch defence. Obviously, their early work has been about putting in place policies and best practice and all the rest of it. And we've very much informed some of that because we've been doing it for a long time. So they've taken some of our best practice and sort of really adapted it and applied it across government. So that's sort of been where we've worked most closely together. At the moment, their focus is very much on looking now at taking those policies and ensure they're being implemented into different departments, and that those different departments, including research agencies, are really starting to identify those brilliant innovations that they need to be identified to get them out there and to start to deliver spin-outs and great new companies and ultimately the growth agenda. So that's where their focus is. They tend not to get involved with defence or security really at any material level. So we kind of work adjacent to each other rather than in massive partnership.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of best practice then, Ploughshare used to own a huge stake in spin-outs to the point that they didn't qualify for Innovate UK funding because they were technically classed as subsidiaries. What work did you do to remedy that situation? I'm assuming you're taking a much smaller stake in spin-outs now.
We are. And this comes to actually one of our cultural sort of missives, for want of a better word. And it's actually sort of driven in part, or large part probably, from my own personal values, right? Which is, if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. And don't wait around for someone else to do something about it. And that drives a culture that is curious, that is driving for change all the time. And this is a great example. As you rightly point out, we thought that Innovate were just being mean because they weren't letting us have grants, because they saw these spin-outs as subsidiaries of us, and we were obviously a subsidiary of the MOD, and therefore they were effectively large enterprises. Because we were holding 89% equity in these spin-outs, which is just crazy, because what happens is you're not investable, you can't get grants, and actually founders don't really want to play because there's not enough in it for them and they're taking massive risks. So they just spin around. And the more interesting ones of them do end up getting out, but after inordinate amounts of negotiation with investors who have to be really resilient and really tenacious to play. So we changed that, and we changed it very quickly. We changed it back in 2021, which was ahead of most universities, I have to say. And we just positioned to our board, it's got MOD colleagues on, that this is wrong, it's crazy, it's resulting in the wrong outcome. Would you rather have 20% equity in a company worth £1 billion or 90% equity in a company worth nothing? Your choice, And the other worry was that founders would end up making loads of money and have a Maserati in the car park at the MOD. And I was able to explain the chances of that happening would mean that it probably isn't something we need to worry about. So that argument landed. It landed well. And since 2021, we start with 20% equity in our spin-outs. Actually, that's changed now. We now own between 5 and 15% equity in our spin-outs to start with. If we invest money of our own, and we've got an accelerator fund, which has also been a game changer, but if we invest money of our own, then we will, of course, take more equity. And we have to be very careful, therefore, not to invest too much such that we end up in a situation where we've got more equity and it's problematic. It's a double reason for us, not just actually you've got to have his spin-outs that are founder and investor friendly or forget about it. But secondly, I've heard from more than one investor that they don't want to invest in our spin-outs because they don't want to invest in a company that is seen as having some form of government control. And we're seen as pseudo-government, and that's a real problem. And again, it's all the more reason why keeping us arm's length from MOD is key, but also making sure that that equity is proportionate and that it's clear what role we have is really, really important.
Yeah. The Accelerator Fund, is that something that you set up as CEO as well?
Yes. So we had a lot of intellectual property coming our way. And what was clear to me was that I had the team scrabbling around working with the Defence Science and Technology Labs to say, have you got 20 grand that we could spend to do a bit of proof of concept on this IP because we're not sure about it? Listeners will probably know that setting up a spin-out company is not trivial. You need to pump prime it. You need to do your business plan, all of which takes time and money. And so we had all this stuff that was, again, just spinning around, not being liberated. We talk about discover the best invention, liberate it really fast, and then scale it up as being the sort of three things that we have to do and we have to do really, really well. Well, these things weren't being liberated. We were discovering them, but they were stuck. So it was very clear to me that we needed to have a funding pot of our own effectively. And we now have an accelerator fund that we have an independent panel that supports the investments in it, but it's very much something that is adjacent to us and we can drive the decision making. And it has invested, I think, about 5-6 million over the last 3 years, sometimes in pure IP, in proof of concepts and developing it further, sometimes in the early stages of a spin out to ensure that it doesn't get stuck. But it's been an absolute game changer. It's what in the UK effectively is being described as proof of concept funding. It's effectively playing that part, but we thought of it long before anybody else.
Much like the lower equity stakes, the Ploughshare Innovations got there first.
Exactly.
Hetti, unfortunately we are out of time. I think we could talk for another hour because you do so many other interesting things that we didn't even touch on. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. It's been a huge pleasure to learn more about Ploughshare and hearing a little bit about your views of the world as well, because I think they're really interesting views. And I came into this maybe thinking I would play a bit of a devil's advocate. To be honest with you, I think I agree with pretty much everything that you have said. So well done.
Thank you, Thierry, and really, really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for everything you do.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
The Next Leap is hosted and produced by me, Thierry Heles. Our artwork is by Jenna Clark, the music is by Alex White, and the production supervisor is Roxy, the best dog in the world. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to reach out to me. You can send me an email at thierry@thenextleap.is. You can also find me on LinkedIn. And if you learned something interesting in today's episodes, which I'm hoping you did, do feel free to share it with your colleagues and post about it on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. And if you do that, make sure to tag me. I like seeing what you have taken away from episodes. That's all for today. Thank you for listening. Or as we say back home in Luxembourg, merci, dass ihr gelauscht habt.